Hi. These are some ideas that could help both diagnose how your hips are out, like if which hip is forward and which hip is higher and if it's turned at all, and then ways that you could mobilize it and stabilize it. And then I'll also maybe just give a couple tips in terms of what you can do in your daily life to help maintain balance in your pelvis, and in your yoga practice also keeping your pelvis balanced. If you have a strap and a block, great, and if not, it's okay. Remember, a scarf or a towel can work like a strap. If you are using a strap, put your end through both rings and go over the first one and under the second one. And then you can tighten the strap so that it's about hip width. And I like to leave mine a little bit looser and then adjust it once I am in. But before we get to that stuff, let me show you a couple ways that you can try and figure out like how your pelvis is off. So if you lay on your back, plant your feet on the floor and try to find where your sacrum is. And move your clothes out of the way so they don't give you a false reading of what's going on there. Okay, and then once you feel the back of your pelvis, like your sacrum is on the floor, you might already notice if one hip is higher than the other hip. Sometimes you need just to like rock a little bit side and side. So I'm trying to feel like where the edge of my sacrum is. And if I roll just to the edge of the sacrum, I can notice that one side is like falling a little bit more. You can just tell one hip is higher than the other hip. And for me, it's my right hip today. It's not always, sometimes it's my left hip. And I know that it's my right hip is up because when I rock to the right a little bit, it feels like there's not as much bone there as there is on the other side when I rock this way. So that's one way that you could tell if your one hip is like forward of the other one. Another thing that you can do to see if one hip is higher than the other one is to wag. So like if you were to wag your tail, trying to keep your back and your pelvis completely flat on the floor, just wag your tail from one side to the other side and notice if one side is tighter than the other side. And if one side is tighter than the other side, that's probably the side that's pulling up. So for me, my left side is a little bit tighter than my right. And I know that my left side contracts a little bit. So you can figure out like if one side is higher than the other. So then try and keep track of like, okay, this hip is forward and this hip is higher. So let's deal with if one hip is higher first. One simple thing that you can do is just lengthen your body out long. I don't know if you can see all of this. I'm gonna lay this way. And bring your arms overhead and then stretch one side. I'm just stretching through my right side. I'm trying to keep my pelvis and my back on the floor as much as possible. And then stretch the other side. And here I can also tell if one of my pelvic halves is higher. So that you could use this as both a diagnostic tool and also as a remedy. So if one side is tighter, you might stay a little bit longer on that side and take a few breaths. Trying again to keep as much of your back on the floor and your pelvis on the floor. And then feel the connection of your heel bone and your sit bone so that you're reaching your sit bone towards your heel. And that'll come in really handy when we get into like downward facing dog and stuff. You can also bend to one side on the floor. And then now I can be really sure that my pelvis is flat on the floor, one hip's not higher than the other one, and my back is flat on the floor. Because sometimes if you do this standing, the pelvis or shoulders will start to turn, and then you don't get as much opening. And you would just stay here for a while. It doesn't have to be the biggest stretch. It doesn't have to be a lot of muscular effort. You're just kind of being there for a while. And then kind of come back whenever you're ready, and again, see how it feels. The simple thing that you can do, if you're going to turn this way, if this hip is higher, I have my feet on the floor, and then I can either just lengthen this leg out, the leg with the hip that's higher, lengthen that one out. Because now this bent leg is tilting my pelvis over to the right a little bit. You could also bend this leg so that it has even more tilt. So I'm gonna just only do the side where my hip is higher. In this case, I won't balance out. I'm not gonna do both sides because this is the one that I need to lower. And again, you could just breathe, stay here and breathe. I'm going to just keep throwing out options, and you use whatever is useful for you. You don't have to do all of these things. Sometimes I feel like my hips feel really stuck. They're just not moving at all, but they're also out of place. So it's like out of place but frozen there. So I like to mobilize, and one of the ways you can do this, it's easy. It might be easiest if you learn it this way. So let's say that one leg is out long. I will push my foot into the floor and track my knee over my toes and just let this one hip lift up. And let everything else be as completely relaxed as possible. And you can go in and out a few times. Just kind of figure out like, okay, this foot pushes down and lifts that hip, right? So if you put both feet on the floor, you can do the same thing. So I'm going to push my right foot into the floor, and it lifts my right hip. I leave my right hip there and push my left foot into the floor and lift my left hip in line with my right now. Now I'm going to leave my left hip there and let the right hip come down, and then bring my left hip down. So it's like a circle: right hip up, left hip up, right hip down, left hip down. And you can go around in a circle. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I'll feel like, this is where it's stuck. So I go up and then kind of slowly go down on one side where it's feeling really sticky until it really loosens up, going up and down like this. So that's another thing that's something you can do to stabilize. Another thing that you can do, if you have a block, grab the block, and I like to put my block this way, right, so that it's about 6 inches or so. It's a little bit wider than my inner hips. Okay, and then if you have a strap, put the strap on your thighs and cinch it down so that it's outer hip width. It's like this. So here's a couple things you could do here. One is, after you've lifted one hip and then the other hip, I don't know if you can see this, like this. Then I'm going to work on lifting both hips really evenly. I press both feet into the floor. I squeeze my heels towards my sit bones a little bit. That engages my hamstrings. Then hug the block and lift. This doesn't have to be high. This isn't about stretching. It's just about stabilizing. So I'm going to try and feel both hips are lifting up equally. And you can just be here for a little while. And with something in between your knees, it's helpful because it's helping me to engage my inner thighs and my pelvic floor and my transverse abdominis. So this deeper abdominal muscle that it's like a big girdle But if the transverse abdominis is really strong here in the low point, like where the pubic bone and the front hip points are, that really helps to stabilize the pelvis. So that's one thing. If you are using a strap and a block, here's a really nice thing that often helps me. So I'm going to squeeze and just squeeze the block, and I already felt a pop around my pubic bone. So you're trying to, move around the pubic bone. There's a joint there. So I squeeze, and then I'm going to do opposite and pull. So now I'm trying to pull my legs away from each other. If you were using just a towel or something, you could just hold the towel like this so that it's taut, and then pull. So now I'm like re-engaging my outer hips, and it feels like it's widening my pelvis. And then again, I squeeze. So you go in and out. Pulling, squeezing. And if something is out of place, it will often like pop or shift here, or you'll feel like where it kind of needs to pop or shift. So I already felt mine kind of move in my pubic bone. I'm going to leave it like that. So you can do this. This has really helped me also to regain and maintain strength of my transverse abdominis. So if you lift your legs, they're at 90-degree angles here, and I'm keeping the natural curve of my lumbar spine. See, it's a little bit off the floor. I'm not going to try and bring it to the floor. I keep a natural curve, so I'm flat on my pelvis, and my pelvis is as neutral as possible. And then I like to have my hands a little bit underneath my buttocks, just in this little cavity here. And then keeping the same angle in your legs, lower your legs and breathe out and pull your belly back. And try not to change the curve in your lumbar, and then come up. So my spine's trying not to change, and my pelvis is trying not to change. I'm only moving the angle of my femur bone in relationship to my pelvis. And do it with your breath. I like to exhale and go down, but you could also inhale and go down. And then exhale to come back, pulling your belly back. Right, so do a lot of those, maybe 10 to 20, without taxing yourself out. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do. There's keep it strong, but keep it loose. Keep it strong, but keep it loose. That's a good mantra. Okay, so in downward facing dog, how should I show this? When you're doing downward facing dog, I'm going to keep this one pretty short, so I'm just coming from tabletop. I'm going to keep a bend in my knees and focus on my hip creases. Imagine that someone had their fingers in your creases and they're pulling you back and up, if you remember that adjust that you sometimes get in a yoga class. But you can do it yourself. So I'm just going to pull both hip flexors back equally, thinking of my spine being right in the middle, right, and drawing my belly in, just like we were just doing on the floor in the transverse abdominis exercise. So this, I'm also standing. I'm trying to stand my feet into the floor. Rather than pushing back or anywhere else, I'm going straight down, because this is going to help me to maintain or clarify like a connection from my sit bone to heel. I'm going to try and stand my feet into the floor in the same way that I'm standing my sit bone down towards my heel. And as my sit bone and my heel feel connected, I'm just going to try and move my hips back really equally so they feel even. Okay? And focus on that. Do that every time you do downward facing dog. So, chair pose. I like to do it with a block because, again, it helps me to maintain this engagement of my inner thighs. You can do this with any width. Make sure that your feet are parallel and that your heels are in the same line, right? If one heel is forward, that means that same hip is going to be forward. So whenever you're doing any sort of symmetrical standing poses, make sure your heels are in alignment with each other. So downward facing dog, chair pose, Tadasana, mountain pose. Here, I deepen my knees forward, right, and sit my hips back. And that same feeling, I'm going to try to engage my glutes by pushing my heels down so that I have a clear connection of my sit bones to my heels. Right? And I'm going to tilt my pelvis forward and try to maintain with a constant engagement this balance, and you can go up and then down like a squat. And I'm trying to tunnel my femur bones back into my sockets equally, making sure that when I do this, it's not one hip that goes back and then the other hip that goes back, but they're really truly going back together. You can do this a few times. I'm trying to build up the musculature around my pelvis at the same time that I'm stabilizing it and balancing it, neutralizing it, so that those muscles start to harmonize on both sides. Here's a thing that I wanted to point out also. Like if you're in a forward fold, anytime that you're in a fold, try to engage the glutes a little bit. So if you come into a forward fold, it's okay if your knees are bent. Press down. Just press down and see what it feels like to stand. What muscles you had to recruit to do it. Pushing down to feel that the glute hamstring engage. Okay, and then go into a forward fold and push down as if you were going to stand, but don't. Push down as if you were going to stand, but don't. And use both legs equally. Make sure that one leg isn't pushing more than the other leg, because that's likely what's kind of pulling the pelvis out of place, is that one leg is not doing as much as the other leg. So when you're in a forward fold, there's still an action of pushing down as if you were going to stand. Here's another thing I think this is maybe the last thing that I'll share. This is super helpful for me. So let's say that in my diagnostic tools here, I decided that my right hip is a bit forward. So knowing that my right hip is too far forward, I try and bring my left hip a little bit forward with it. So find a wall or something, stand a little further away than arm's length. Since it's my right hip that's forward, and I'm going to try and bring my left hip forward to meet it. So I'm going to work with my left leg. The left hip is farther back, so I put my left foot in my left hand. And a little bit like dancer, I just push. Lean slightly forward. Again, this isn't about like a big dancer. This is just about pushing your foot into your hand to move that same hip forward. And just push for like 20 seconds. And then come out and stand and see what it feels like. Or walk around a little bit. See if it feels any better. If they feel a little bit more aligned. Sometimes I also like to check just by doing a little forward fold. See, my sacrum feels like it's in the right place. Or do a little back bend. When your pelvis starts to neutralize, where it becomes more neutral, it's so much easier. It feels so much better to back bend and forward bend. So you can also use that as like a, did it work or did it not work? I would recommend trial and error with all of this. Play around and see play around and see what helps. Again, if you're trying to balance your pelvis, you just do these things on one side, especially like this dancer one. I wouldn't do the other side because then that would move my other hip forward again, and that would be opposite of what I wanted to do. The last thing that I wanted to say was just about, like, in your day-to-day life, being really conscious about where your pelvis is. That your front hip points are pointing directly forward when you're sitting or standing. And that your sit bones are right underneath you. So your pelvis is neutral. Just notice when you do sit onto one side, it's fine. But switch. Switch sometimes so that you're not just on one side. Having said that, I would recommend, because I have also gone too far in this direction where it's like, no, I can't, my pelvis has to be only right here, like only neutral. It can move a lot of different ways, and it should move a lot of different ways. A healthy pelvis will be really movable, but also stable. But if it only moves in one way all the time, like right now, my right hip is higher than my left, this side feels, you'll notice that you have a preference. Just switch it. Keep switching back and forth whenever you're sitting, or when you notice that one hip is higher than the other one. Let's sit in the opposite way for sometimes. But when you're standing, try and stand on both feet. If you tend to shift onto one side, fine. Remember, it's okay for your pelvis to shift. It should be movable. But if I'm always standing on my left side is going to be shorter. So sometimes switch over to the right. Try and balance it out whenever you're waiting for the bus or the train or standing around or whatever we end up doing that changes how the pelvis is. Okay, so one more thing. When you're working in yoga postures, and let's say that I know that my right hip is a little bit further forward than my left, I'm going to keep trying to balance it. Like, let's say that I'm in a warrior, let's say I'm in extended side angle. And this hip is going to be a little bit down. And for me, on this side, with my right hip being a little further forward than my left, on this side, I'm going to turn maybe my left hip a little bit further down than I would on the other side. So that when you switch, I'm going to actually try and pull this hip slightly further back than I did on the other side. So that both sides aren't going to be exactly the same. You have to do according to how your pelvis is, if you're trying to neutralize it or if it feels out. So on this side, my right hip, I'm going to try and pull it back a bit. But on this side, I'm actually going to pull my left hip forward, right hip back. So consider that whenever you're doing any of the standing postures. Knowing how your pelvis is out of place, having used those diagnostic tools, hopefully they helped. I hope that helped. Let me know how it goes. And if you have any questions. Okay, be well.